What if the biggest surprise in this new U.S. Canada trade fight is not what Trump said about Canada, but what happened after Canada refused to back down? Washington expected pressure to force Ottawa toward a deal. Instead, the talks collapsed, new U.S. tariffs hit Canadian goods, and Mark Carney answered with a move that could make the fight much more expensive for both countries. Now the question is no longer just about steel, dairy, lumber, or billions of dollars in trade. It is about how far each side is willing to go before the economic damage becomes too large to ignore. And there is one date sitting in the middle of this entire crisis, September 8th. That is when Canada's planned retaliation is set to begin. So how did two countries that have one of the world's biggest trading relationships get here, and why did a deal that looked close suddenly fall apart? Let's go back to the moment everything changed. For months, the United States and Canada had been trying to reach a new trade arrangement while dealing with a growing list of tariffs and disagreements. On the surface, this looked like a normal trade fight. One side wanted better access for its businesses, and the other wanted protection for its workers and industries. Both governments were trying to get the best deal possible. But the latest round was different. The talks had reached a point where a deal appeared possible. Then, at the last moment, the two sides failed to agree. The result was not another delay or another short pause. The United States moved ahead with new 50% tariffs on about $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Those tariffs cover a wide range of products, including items such as dairy, clothing, paper products, cement, and other goods entering the American market. And that number matters. $20 billion may sound small compared with the total size of the U.S. and Canadian economies, but tariffs do not stay on a government spreadsheet. They move through companies, suppliers, stores, factories, and supply chains. Imagine a Canadian company selling a product to an American buyer. Before the tariff, the American importer pays the normal cost. Once a 50% tariff is applied, the cost of bringing that product into the United States rises sharply. The importer now has a choice. It can accept the higher cost and make less money. It can raise the price for the American customer. Or it can look for another supplier. None of those choices is simple. And this is why trade wars can become much bigger than the original tariff number suggests. The real fight is about who absorbs the cost. Trump's position has been that tariffs can pressure foreign countries into changing their behavior and can protect American workers and industries. Canada, however, sees the new measures as a major economic hit and has decided that simply accepting them would create even greater problems. That is where Mark Carney enters the story. After the talks collapsed, Canada's Prime Minister did not announce that Ottawa was going to accept the new American terms and wait for another opportunity. He went in the opposite direction. Carney announced that Canada would respond with its own tariffs on American products, and that the response would be dollar for dollar. The Canadian measures are scheduled to begin on September 8th, and will target American goods in areas including steel, electronics, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and other products. That created an entirely new situation. Because once both countries begin taxing each other's products, the pressure does not move in only one direction. American companies that depend on Canadian suppliers can face higher costs. Canadian companies that depend on American customers can face higher costs. Manufacturers on both sides can find themselves paying more for parts and materials. And eventually, some of those costs can reach ordinary consumers. That is why the collapse of these talks matters far beyond Ottawa and Washington. But there is another reason this moment is different. Carney is not describing the dispute as a simple argument over tariff rates. He has framed the disagreement as something much larger. According to reporting from Reuters and other major outlets, Carney said the final U.S. demands went beyond the basic tariff questions and included issues affecting Canada's auto sector and its ability to make future trade deals. Canadian officials have also described concerns involving Canada's cultural and language protections. The Trump administration has presented a different version of the negotiations, putting more focus on American workers, supply chains, and tariff reductions in key industries. That difference is extremely important. Because if this were only about whether steel should face one tariff rate or another, the two governments could eventually meet somewhere in the middle. But if one side believes the other is asking for limits on its wider trade policy, then the argument becomes much harder to solve. Suddenly, it is not only about money, it becomes about control. It becomes about what Canada is willing to give up in order to maintain easier access to the American market. And that is exactly where Carney's reaction becomes politically powerful. Canada is deeply connected to the United States economically. Around 3/4 of Canada's exports go south into the American market, according to the Associated Press. That makes Canada's position difficult. Ottawa cannot simply pretend the American market does not matter, but Carney is making a different calculation. His message is essentially this: economic dependence does not mean Canada should accept every demand placed in front of it. That is a risky position. If Canada refuses to compromise, the tariffs can cause real damage to Canadian businesses. But if Canada accepts terms that its government believes go too far, Carney could face a different kind of damage, political damage at home and questions about whether Canada protected its own interests. So the Canadian government has chosen to fight back. And this is where Trump's warning becomes more interesting. The public story can easily be reduced to one simple idea. America is the larger economy, Canada is the smaller economy, and therefore Canada should eventually give in. But the latest events show why that assumption is dangerous. Canada does not need to match the United States dollar for dollar in economic size to create pain for American businesses. It only needs to target products that matter. It only needs to make certain supply chains more expensive. And it only needs to keep the pressure alive long enough for American companies, workers, governors, lawmakers, and consumers to start asking whether the fight is worth the cost. That pressure may become especially important as September 8th approaches. Because until that date, there is still room for the two sides to change direction. There is still room for another meeting. There is still room for another offer, and there is still room for a deal. But if September 8th arrives and Canada's counter tariffs go into effect, the conflict enters another stage. At that point, the United States will not simply be imposing tariffs on Canada. Canada will be actively imposing costs on American goods in return. And once that cycle begins, every new tariff can create a reason for another response. That is how a trade dispute can grow. One tariff creates another. One response creates another response. And eventually, neither side is simply negotiating over the original issue anymore. They are negotiating under the pressure of economic damage that they themselves helped create. This is why the collapse of the latest talks is so important. The United States and Canada were not starting from zero. They already had years of deep economic connections, integrated factories, shared supply chains, and millions of dollars in cross-border business every day. Now those connections are becoming part of the battlefield. And there is still one major question that has not been fully answered. What exactly happened inside the final negotiations that made Canada decide walking away was better than accepting the deal? Because according to the Canadian side, the final American demands went much further than ordinary tariff negotiations. The American side tells a different story. And until the actual details of those final demands become clearer, one thing is certain. The disagreement is no longer just about tariffs. It is about what each country believes it is allowed to demand from the other. And in the next part, that is where the story gets even more serious. Because Carney's explanation points toward demands that could affect Canada's future trade relationships, its auto industry, and even areas that Canada considers part of its national identity. That is the part of the negotiation that could explain why the deal did not simply fail. It could explain why Canada chose to walk away. The most important part of the story may not be the 50% tariff at all. The real turning point happened inside the final hours of the negotiations, when Canada says the American side started asking for things that went far beyond the normal fight over steel, dairy, or lumber. That claim changes the entire meaning of the collapse. If the disagreement was only about tariff numbers, both sides had plenty of room to compromise. But if the final demands reached into Canada's wider trade policy and other sensitive areas, then Carney was facing a much bigger choice. Accept a deal that could limit Canada's freedom to act or walk away, and accept the economic pain that would follow. According to Carney's account, the final American position included demands connected to Canada's future trade relationships. In simple terms, the concern was not only about what Canada sells to America, but about who Canada could trade with outside America and under what conditions. That is a major difference. A normal tariff negotiation asks questions like how much tax should be placed on steel, how much dairy can enter a market, or what rules should apply to cars. But a demand that touches Canada's other trade partners moves the discussion into a completely different area. It starts asking how much freedom Canada has to make its own economic choices. Think about it this way. Imagine Canada wants to build a stronger business relationship with Europe, Asia, or another major economy. Canada wants to sell more products there, attract investment, and sign new agreements. Normally, those are decisions made by Canada. But if access to the American market becomes linked to limits on those future deals, Ottawa suddenly has to think about Washington every time it considers a new trade partner. That is why Carney has treated this as more than a simple argument over tariffs. The economic relationship with America is huge, but Canada is also trying to reduce the risk of depending on one market for almost everything. That strategy becomes much harder if every new trade decision can become part of a dispute with Washington. And this is where the word sovereignty becomes important. Sovereignty simply means a country has the right to make its own major decisions. Canada can choose its trade partners. Canada can set its own economic rules. Canada can protect industries that it believes are important. Canada can decide how much access foreign companies receive to its markets. So when Carney says the dispute is becoming a question of sovereignty, he is trying to move the argument away from a narrow fight about dollars and percentages. His message is that Canada may be willing to accept economic pressure, but it does not want economic pressure to decide Canada's wider national choices. But there is a very important problem here. The two governments do not agree on the full story. Canada says the American demands became too broad and included issues that went beyond normal trade negotiations. U.S. officials have described the talks differently, focusing on protecting American workers, supply chains, and improving access for American products. That means viewers should be careful with the strongest claims coming from either side. The exact final proposals have not been made public in a way that completely settles every part of this dispute. So there is still a gap between what Ottawa says happened in the room and what Washington says it was trying to achieve. That gap may actually be one of the biggest reasons this fight is becoming so difficult to solve. When two countries cannot even agree on what was requested during the final stage of negotiations, it becomes much harder to build trust for the next meeting. Canada can say, "You asked for too much." America can answer, "We were offering a better deal." And both sides can walk away believing the other side is being unreasonable. Once that happens, every new statement becomes part of the political battle. The negotiation is no longer happening only behind closed doors. It is happening in front of voters, businesses, workers, and investors who are all watching the next move. There is another sensitive issue that makes Carney's version even more politically powerful. Canada has spent decades protecting its French language and cultural institutions, especially in Quebec. These are not simply business rules that can be changed overnight during a tariff negotiation. They are tied to Canada's national identity and its political system. So any suggestion that these areas could become part of a trade bargain would naturally create a strong reaction inside Canada. It would allow Carney to argue that the fight is not just about whether Canadian products pay more at the American border. It is about whether Canada should change important parts of its own system because Washington is demanding it. That is why the political effect of Carney's response may be just as important as the economic effect. If he had accepted a deal that many Canadians believed weakened the country's freedom to make its own decisions, he could have faced serious criticism at home. But by refusing to accept terms he considers unacceptable, he can present himself as protecting Canada's interests during a period of intense pressure. The risk is obvious, though. Political strength does not cancel economic reality. Canada still sends a very large share of its exports to the United States, meaning a long trade fight can create serious problems for Canadian factories, farmers, exporters, and workers. This creates the difficult balance Carney now has to manage. He has to convince Canadians that standing firm is worth the cost, while also making sure the economy can survive the pressure. He cannot simply say that Canada will fight forever. At some point, businesses need certainty. Companies need to know where they will sell their products. Farmers need to know whether their goods can cross the border at a competitive price. Manufacturers need to know whether parts will become more expensive. Investors need to know whether the rules will change again next week. The longer the dispute continues, the more difficult those decisions become. And that brings the story to the most interesting question. Why would Washington make demands that Canada says it could never accept? One possible explanation is leverage. The United States has a much larger economy and a huge market that Canadian companies depend on. From Washington's point of view, that gives the White House powerful bargaining power. The idea would be simple. Increase pressure, force Canada to make deeper concessions, then reduce the tariffs once the desired changes are accepted. But there is a weakness in that strategy. The more pressure America applies, the more incentive Canada has to find other markets and reduce its dependence on the United States. That is already becoming part of Canada's wider economic strategy. Ottawa has been talking about finding new markets, building stronger relationships outside the United States, and making the Canadian economy less dependent on one trading partner. The trade war could therefore produce an outcome that Washington does not want. Instead of making Canada more closely tied to America, constant tariff threats could push Canadian businesses toward Europe, Asia, and other markets. That process would not happen overnight, and the United States would remain Canada's largest trading partner for a long time. But once companies start changing where they invest, where they buy materials, and where they sell products, those changes can become difficult to reverse. There's also a bigger issue sitting behind the September 8th deadline. Canada's retaliation is not designed simply to make a political statement. It is meant to create pressure on American companies and industries that depend on Canadian business. The plan targets products including steel, electronics, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and other goods. In other words, Canada is trying to make sure the pressure is not felt only north of the border. If American businesses begin telling Washington that Canadian retaliation is hurting them, the trade dispute could create a new political problem inside the United States. That is the part Trump and his team now have to watch carefully. Tariffs are powerful because they can change the cost of trade very quickly. But that same power can work in both directions. A tariff placed on Canadian goods may hurt Canadian exporters, but a Canadian response can hurt American exporters. The question then becomes which side feels the political pain first, and which government decides that another round of escalation is no longer worth it. And that answer may not come from Washington or Ottawa alone. It may come from factories, farms, ports, retailers, and state governments that suddenly find themselves caught between two governments fighting over a deal. So Carney's reaction was not simply a refusal to sign a trade agreement. It was a decision to draw a line around what Canada says it is willing to negotiate. He is effectively saying that tariffs can be discussed, market access can be discussed, and trade rules can be discussed. But there are limits to how far economic pressure should reach into Canada's wider national choices. Whether that position will ultimately strengthen Canada's hand or expose the country to greater economic pain is still unknown. What is clear is that the fight has now moved beyond the original tariff dispute, and both governments are preparing for a much longer struggle if neither side changes course. And now the pressure shifts to the other side of the border. Because while Canada is preparing to absorb the cost of retaliation, something unexpected is beginning to happen inside America itself. American governors, lawmakers, businesses, and consumers have their own reasons to question whether this fight is worth the price. If that pressure grows before September 8th, Trump's biggest challenge may not come from Carney at all. It may come from Americans who suddenly realize that a trade war with Canada does not stop at the border. But now the story takes a turn that Washington may not have expected. The biggest pressure on Trump may not come from Ottawa, and it may not come from Carney standing behind a Canadian flag. It may come from American businesses and communities that suddenly have to deal with the cost of another trade fight. The new 50% tariffs are already in effect on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, while Canada has announced dollar-for-dollar retaliation beginning September 8th. That means the next stage of this dispute could reach far beyond the two leaders making the decisions. It could reach factories, farms, stores, transport companies, and families on both sides of the border. And this is where the word reckless becomes much more important. In a political fight, strong language is easy. A president can accuse another country of taking advantage of America, while the other leader can accuse Washington of using economic pressure. But businesses do not operate on speeches. They operate on costs, contracts, workers, supplies, and customers. If the price of a Canadian product suddenly rises because of a 50% tariff, someone has to absorb that extra cost. Sometimes it will be the Canadian exporter. Sometimes it will be an American importer. And sometimes the cost will move through the supply chain until an American customer pays more at the end. That is why the September 8th deadline is so important. Canada has said its retaliation will hit a range of American goods, including steel, dairy, electronics, appliances, and agricultural equipment. This is not simply a symbolic response designed for television cameras. The goal is to create pressure inside the United States by making the effects of the trade war visible to American companies. If an American manufacturer suddenly pays more for access to Canadian markets, that company has a reason to call Washington. If an American exporter loses Canadian customers, that business has a reason to demand a solution. And if enough industries start doing that at the same time, the political pressure can become very difficult to ignore. The strange part is that both sides can claim they are protecting their own workers while creating new problems for the same workers. Trump can argue that tariffs are designed to defend American jobs and supply chains. Carney can argue that retaliation is necessary to defend Canadian businesses and national interests. Both arguments can sound strong when delivered from a political stage. But the economy does not care which side has the better speech. A factory still needs parts. A farmer still needs buyers. A retailer still needs affordable products. And a family still notices when the price of something rises. That is the hidden danger of a trade war. The political victory can look powerful at the beginning, while the economic bill arrives much later. And there is another problem for Washington. Canada is not an ordinary trading partner that can simply be replaced overnight. The two economies are deeply connected, with supply chains crossing the border every day. Energy, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, metals, food, and countless other industries depend on that relationship. Even when tariffs target only certain products, the effects can spread because companies often rely on several connected suppliers. One higher cost can move to another company, then another, until the original tariff becomes part of a much larger business problem. That is why the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to predict who will actually pay the final price. For Carney, the calculation is just as difficult. Standing up to Washington may strengthen his political position and give Canadians a sense that their government is refusing to surrender under pressure. But Canada still has an enormous economic connection to the United States. Around 3/4 of Canadian exports have traditionally gone south, which means Ottawa cannot simply walk away from the American market and replace it with Europe or Asia next month. Building new trade relationships takes years. Companies need new customers, new shipping routes, new contracts, and new investment. So while diversification can reduce Canada's dependence on America over time, it cannot remove the pressure created by today's tariffs overnight. That leaves Carney facing a very difficult test. He has to prove that refusing what he calls a bad deal does not mean accepting permanent economic weakness. His government is already talking about expanding Canadian trade beyond the United States and attracting more investment. The idea is simple. If America can use Canada's dependence on the U.S. market as leverage, then Canada needs to reduce that dependence. But that strategy only works if Canadian companies can actually find large new markets and compete there. The trade war may therefore create a long-term economic shift that neither government originally intended. Instead of bringing Canada closer to the United States, it could encourage Canada to look elsewhere. And that may be the biggest strategic question in the entire confrontation. What happens if Canada stops believing that the American market will always be stable? For decades, Canadian companies could build their plans around the assumption that the border would remain relatively open and predictable. That assumption is now being questioned. Businesses may begin asking whether it is safer to invest in Canada for export to Europe, Asia, or other markets, rather than build everything around American demand. The changes may start slowly, but once companies move factories, suppliers, and investment decisions, they do not always move them back simply because a political agreement is signed. The same risk exists for the United States. American companies have spent decades building relationships with Canadian suppliers and customers. If those companies begin searching for alternatives because they no longer trust the stability of the relationship, America could also lose part of the economic advantage created by such close integration. This is why trade policy is never only about tariffs. It is also about trust. Companies invest billions based on what they believe the rules will look like 5 or 10 years from now. If those rules suddenly change every few months, investment becomes harder and uncertainty itself becomes a cost. That brings us back to Trump's final warning. If the purpose of the tariffs is to force Canada back to the negotiating table, then Washington needs to answer one basic question. What does success actually look like? Is success lower Canadian tariffs on American goods? Is it better access for American companies? Is it a new trade agreement? Or is Washington asking Canada to make broader changes that Ottawa says cross a line it cannot accept? Until that question is answered clearly, every new tariff simply creates another round of pressure without solving the original dispute. Carney faces the same question from the opposite direction. If Canada is willing to fight, how long is it willing to fight? How much economic pain can Canadian businesses absorb? How much government support will be needed? And at what point does defending sovereignty become more expensive than accepting a compromise? Those are not questions that can be answered with a single speech. They will be answered by jobs, investment, exports, prices, and political pressure over the weeks ahead. There are now 3 possible paths. The first is a return to negotiations. The pressure becomes too high. Both governments realize that the costs are growing, and Trump and Carney eventually search for a face-saving agreement. That would not mean either side admits defeat. It would mean both sides decide that a deal is cheaper than another round of escalation. This is still possible, because trade relationships this large create strong reasons for both countries to find a way back to the table. The second path is a much bigger escalation. September 8th arrives, Canadian retaliation begins, Washington responds with another round of tariffs, and the cycle continues. Each government then has to prove to its own voters that it is not backing down. That is the dangerous path, because once national pride becomes tied to economic policy, compromise becomes politically harder. A leader may know that a deal makes economic sense, but still fear looking weak for accepting it. And when both sides face that problem at the same time, even a small dispute can become much larger. The third path is the most interesting because it could continue even after the political fight ends. Canada begins seriously diversifying away from the American market, while American companies also rethink how much they depend on Canadian suppliers. The two economies remain deeply connected, but the relationship becomes less automatic. More trade moves elsewhere. More investment goes into alternative supply chains. More businesses prepare for future political shocks. In that world, the current trade war becomes more than a temporary disagreement. It becomes the moment when both countries decided that the old economic relationship could no longer be taken for granted. And that is why Carney's reaction has shocked so many observers. He did not respond by simply asking for another extension or accepting the pressure in the hope that Washington would eventually soften its position. He suspended the talks, announced retaliation, and made sovereignty part of the argument. He is betting that Canada can survive the pressure long enough to force a better outcome. Trump is betting that American economic power can create enough pressure to force Canada back toward Washington's terms. The next few weeks will show which calculation was closer to reality. But there is one detail that should not be forgotten. The public record still contains major disagreements over what exactly happened in the final negotiations. Canada says the United States introduced new demands that were unfair and went beyond what Ottawa could accept. U.S. officials have argued that Canada walked away from terms designed to protect American workers and supply chains. Until the full negotiating documents become public, nobody outside that room can honestly claim to know every detail. That uncertainty matters because it means the strongest claims from either side should be treated carefully. What is not uncertain is what happened next. The negotiations collapsed. The 50% U.S. tariffs took effect. Canada announced dollar-for-dollar retaliation for September 8th. The future of the wider North American trade relationship has become less certain. And a relationship that once looked almost impossible to break is now facing one of its biggest tests in decades. So was Trump's final warning enough to make Canada surrender? Right now, the answer appears to be no. Instead, the warning produced a counterattack. It pushed Carney toward a harder position. It created new uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border. And it opened a much larger question about whether economic pressure can force a close ally to accept terms it believes threaten its long-term interests. The next major date is September 8th. If Canada follows through with its retaliation, the pressure will no longer be moving in one direction. American companies will feel it. Canadian companies will feel it. Consumers may feel it. And politicians on both sides will have to decide whether winning the argument is more important than stopping the economic damage. Because this is no longer just Trump versus Carney. It is now a test of how much economic pain the United States and Canada are willing to accept before both sides realize that the most powerful move may not be another tariff. It may be sitting down and making a deal.